Right. Any risks that are identified risk, right, can be treated in four ways, right? You can avoid, you can mitigate, you can transfer, or you can accept the risk, right? Let's start with avoid. Can someone say what's avoiding a risk? Yep, sorry. So the major idea from a risk avoidance perspective, and you guys are right, from the major idea of risk avoidance perspective is making sure that the risk that gets emerged from any of the maybe projects, product technologies, or people, process, really anything, right? Any risks that's getting identified, and if you're seeing that we either it has a very large impact financially, reputationally, or from a legal perspective, it's really going to impact to a very high level to which we really cannot tolerate, or we don't really have the appetite for that. We will not do the process, or will not implement, or will not go ahead with that particular tools or technologies altogether. And that's your risk avoidance, right? We are not really going ahead with that, so that we don't, if we are not implementing any sort of people process technology, and any risk that's coming out of any project, or maybe really anything, if you are not going ahead with that, there would be no risk from that perspective. Maybe that may impact operationally, maybe, from a profit perspective, as you mentioned, or it really could be anything, but still we are avoiding the risk at a very large scale in the organization. So that's on the avoidance. That's one of the types. What is mitigating the risk? All right, cool. So from a risk treatment plan perspective, it's really recommended that we should be going ahead with the mitigation part than anything else, right? If it's really the case wherein we cannot go ahead with avoid, transfer, or accept, I'm sorry, with mitigate, then we can either opt for avoiding the risk, or transferring the risk, or accepting the risk. All right. What's risk transfer? Yeah, so the legal binding or the legal contract would not typically, call out the specific risk with that particular entity, but what it would
Mhm.
largely say that the final accountability would sit with the client. So, say the client
Okay.
owns the Citrix environment, and you're just a user in that for whatever reason, and you really don't have the admin capability or any responsibility onto that, then definitely
Right.
the final risk is sitting with the client and not anyone else out there, right? The legal document should clearly state that all the security measures taken onto the Citrix environment, or really could be anything, right? Any XYZ application would be sitting with ABC, and they would be the final accountable entity to make sure that all the appropriate security controls are being taken care of, and that would address your risk transfer to them.
Okay.
All right, so the last one is really the risk acceptance, right? So sorry, on the risk transfer, we do have insurances, right? So that is also one way to transfer your risk. That's right. So say that if you are outsourcing an entire SOC capability to a third party vendor, right? That means any risk arising from the threat identification and those sort of stuff would be transferred to your third party, right? However, it's really tricky, and it's really important to understand, while you are transferring the risk, you are defining, and that's where I was coming to as well, that you are clearly defining the shared responsibility, right? So say that if I have outsourced my SOC capability to a third party vendor, which is largely the case with SMBs out there, and it's becoming a norm, and it's becoming a trend in the entire industry, right? So if you're outsourcing your SOC capability to a third party vendor, definitely you're transferring some, or I would say majority of the risk arising from the identification and rectification and the incident review and those sort of stuff, right? However, there would also be a shared responsibility. Say that there's a threat that you need to address as a firm, right? That we need to address as a firm. They would only identify and make sure that they are intimating us in a timely manner, which they did already, but it's us who would be applying the patches, or modifying the firewall rule, or whatever it may be, right? Whatever it could really be anything, right? And that is my risk. So those level of shared responsibilities needs to be defined in the SLA agreement, and that also needs to be apprised in your a risk assessment template, or or the risk mitigation strategies as well. That this is the risk that would arise typically from the SOC perspective, and this is being transferred to a third party vendor. And from a third party vendor's perspective, these are the set of controls that we have, that we are monitoring. So that's taken care of. However, a part of that risk lies with us from an accountability perspective, and this is what we have in place. So we really need to have that level of clarity when we are transferring the risk, because at times it becomes really difficult to have that I would say that sort of understanding from a shared responsibility perspective. Ideally, from an industry perspective, what I've seen is that when it breaches the appetite, companies would have additional layer of controls, right? And
Correct.
this would not be activated unless you have breached the appetite. This would be on standby sort of stuff. And once you have breached the appetite, these controls would be applicable. But before applying these controls to that particular risk, there would be an assessment of the future likelihood of breaching the tolerance as well, right? And say that the assessment, say the outcome of the assessment is that it may also breach the risk tolerance, we would avoid the risk altogether. We will not take that risk. So it could be so there could be a situation wherein you could have additional layer of controls, right? Either it could be activated automatically, or you could do it manually. If it is a manual, uh, the chances are that the company would go for an assessment internally to make sure that to define the likelihood of breaching the risk tolerance as well. And if it is highly likely that it's going to breach the tolerance too, then the risk avoidance would kick in. And if not, then they would certainly go ahead with applying the additional controls that we have. But ideally, the risk avoidance would kick in after the tolerance and not on the appetite. And that's why we have the tolerance in place, to
Okay.
make sure that we are not taking extreme steps as soon as the appetite is hit, right? So that's how it is right
Okay.
now. So I'll take the same example, the SOC capability, right? Now, say that from a company's perspective, if I want to have my internal SOC team and I don't really want to rely on a third party vendor, these are the set of tools and technologies that we would need. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect is to run those tools and technologies, the operational cost, right? That is the second one. And the third one is really to hire the relevant skill set within the team, right? And when we talk about the cost benefit analysis, say that my soft capability itself, if I'm trying to build internally, is breaching close to $800,000, right? Including your salaries, including your operational overheads, and your implementation costs and whatnot. However, if I am able to transfer the SOC capability to a third party, it would be merely close to $250,000 per year, right? And on over a 5 years period of time, with these two options, the end cost would look something like this. So you have the cost analysis with you and the value proposition from each of those. So things would happen from there, that whether or not should we go ahead with that, and what's the difference, and what's the kind of value that we are getting. So yes, we'll have those assessments before we transfer the risk to anyone out there. Cannot go beyond my risk appetite. That's that's a borderline. However, tolerance could kick in a very rare scenario. We don't really have to rely on the tolerance altogether, but risk appetite is a borderline, but then tolerance is there in for some rare case scenarios. Yeah. All right, cool. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So risk acceptance could be in two scenarios, wherein the first one is really applying the controls, applying the relevant controls, and bringing down the risk to your residual risk, and determining that whether or not the residual risk is up to our risk acceptance level, right? The other one is the risk that's already there, and which does not have much of an impact on the business right now, and we say that we are accepting the risk, and this is the level of impact that may have if should this risk arise, right? So say that if should a risk arise, say R01, and if it has an impact on the business in a worst case scenario, I would be losing somewhere close to $20,000 to $30,000, right? And the control that I will apply to reduce this amount would be much higher than $30,000. Henceforth, we are accepting the risk. So really, the idea is to make sure that the we are knowing about the impact. We know that what level of impact it's going to have on the overall business from a financial perspective, from a legal perspective, and from a reputational perspective as well. um, and once we know what's the impact, we agree to that and we say that we have accepted the risk. So that's pretty much it on the type of mitigation strategies, right?